Welcome, everybody, to what is, I guess, a PCS and LCO and LJL, the overall playoffs pre-show, trying to get ready for next week's competition. And with me today, I have a few guests coming up. First of all, we're going to have Tallywacker. He is a four-time Oceanic champion, as well as the colorcaster and analyst over at the LCO for the most recent year. And going to be here, I guess, to provide us some insight on Team Bliss and Ground Zero ahead of their games, and maybe I'll come in with some counters of what I think are good from the PCS side of things. And so, first of all, I guess I'll start with an overview just of the teams first before we get into the specific matchups. So, I did keep up with the LCO as much as I can, especially when it got into the playoffs. Obviously, watching Ground Zero nearly go completely undefeated outside of that Bliss series in the grand final, where they did drop game number 1. But obviously, coming into the PCS playoffs, I have to assume you're feeling confident about Ground Zero, more so than Bliss. Would that be correct?
I would say what we're seeing right now in the current meta is that, in our playoffs, it was always about that, AD carry mid, mage jungle. And I think that, if you look overseas, it's kind of falling out of favor right now, going back towards mages in mid, which I think for Harry specifically is extremely good for him. I think that he is a really good laner, and mages are what you want to do as a laner. So I think I'm confident for Bliss to bounce back from the performance we saw in finals. But talking about Ground Zero and the performance that they have specifically, it's just they haven't really showed anything besides that one style. They just have honed in on that playstyle that's worked so well for them as a team. And I think that if they are going to be able to keep doing that throughout the playoffs at the PCS, I'm quite confident for them too.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. And I guess I'll compare Team Bliss. We'll start with them in comparison to the Spring Split. Obviously, Spring Split playoffs, Harry, coming into the playoffs, it seemed like watching the LCO, he was very much a Orianna and Azir merchant. He was playing a lot of those over in the LCO, came over to the PCS for the playoffs. Azir's disabled, made that like pretty rough for honestly every single mid lane at the time, but I think especially Harry, because it seemed to me, at least watching the LCO at the time, if he was on Azir, he was much more likely to just 1v9 a game, to put it bluntly. He was very, very talented on that champion. Comes over to the PCS, where honestly a lot of the mid laners just play whatever they want. I mean, specifically, I think Chris Scarter obviously last split 20 unique champions, and admittedly they didn't really have to go up against them too hard, but it was still going to be always a challenge, right? As you're going against these mid laners who play so much, you've only shown really 2 champions. One of them's just been disabled. How much practice have you got on those other champions, especially in the current meta? Items change and everything. So even if you historically have played a lot of other champs, like, I don't know, probably a bad example, but Syndra or Victor or whoever the control mages could be, you get to the current meta, a lot of different items, how you play the matchups changes because of that. And it feels like you kind of got, I don't know, what would be the word here? Just hindered by Riot for having a bug on Azir where you're just like, you've lost possibly your best champion. Do you think now that maybe Azir's back, it's not going to be disabled, you get those control mages, as you said, do you think this is going to be a better look for him? Especially they're going up against Frank, and it is Jimmy and who he's going up against, and he's actually had prior practice against him in the past. Do you think him being able to explore more champions is going to be beneficial? And do you think that will make a difference in their specific matchup up against Frank Esports?
I think that, Harry having versed Jimmy in the academy over in NA is also like nice to know that he can go into a familiar match and be like, okay, I know what this player is good at. I know what champs I want to play. So, talking about what we're seeing in the mid lane right now with mages coming back in, I think that Bliss as a team in the early game are sort of reliant on Harry to be able to take over, any form of the early game, happening, and pairing that with Aladoric moving around the map. So seeing mages come back in, giving a bit more agency in the laning phase, because when he is sitting on stuff like the Corki, the Zeri, he's just, scaling. He doesn't really have that impact we're going to see from in the early game. So I think the mages coming back is very good for him. But also on the other side, at Ground Zero, I think that Fido is a traditional mage player as well. He's just a bit more, explosive when it comes to, stuff like the Vex, the Ryze, the Cassio, these champs we don't really see, but I know that he is going to pull out some crazy stuff if it does come to it. And that's why I did coin him like the Christ God, the Christ God of OS, because he has a very, very weird champion pool. Even see him play stuff like the Akshan already. So he is, quite happy to do whatever his team needs to succeed. And I think that the meta right now going back towards those more lane dominating champs in the Azir, the Orianna coming back as well. And even if stuff like the Syndra does pop back up, I'm quite happy for them to play the champions. But I'm still curious to see if Aurora is going to be enabled, because if that is, I think that could be a meta-defining pick, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, we can't play AP junglers anymore because Aurora needs to be on our team because that champ looks quite strong.
Yeah, and I guess on that note too, if Aurora is enabled, I don't actually really know just as of yet. That could also just end up becoming, because at least from my solo queue experience, it is just so obscene. Like, and it's not even like most of the kit. It's you press R and just do 1,000,000 damage for fun. Like, and it's just so unavoidable. And that maybe it just becomes like another Rumble, you know, just a tax on the red side where you're now just, instead of only banning Rumble, and then you get the choice of a few other bans. You can ban specific to the opposing team, or you could just ban some of those OPs that, you know, may be very easy to play. Some what would be the word? Like fill the holes. You know, sometimes there's a weaker jungler, so you just ban the Maokai, the Sejuani, puts them on something that is a little more volatile and you can exploit. Maybe it's just going to be forced now that you have to ban Aurora Rumble. And if you're a team that is on the blue side, it might just mean that you have an advantage already heading into the draft. And that oftentimes can sort of define a series. I mean, at least in the PCS historically, we often get to the grand finals or just, you know, any 5-game series, and you have the entire series where one particular side, traditionally it's the blue side, just wins every game. It's just whatever team's on blue. So whoever, I guess, wins is higher up in the seeds. They just win the series because they're blue more often. Do you think that could be a case with Aurora, or do you think it's not quite at the point where it's just 100% needs to be perma-banned? Do you think it's like maybe, yeah, it's very strong in isolation against certain compositions? Like maybe there's a way to play Ezreal against it. I feel like that champ, at least in my experience, does well. Can pretty much avoid the ult essentially. You know, and Ezreal mid kind of is pretty good right now. Do you think there's an angle there? Do you think it's going to be another red side tax, etc.?
I was thinking, because like if you think about how Aurora functions as a champion, right? So you compare it to, let's say, Orianna, like a traditional mage. It's like she has her AoE ult, but it's very telegraphed and predictable. You can flash it, you can outplay it. But then you look at Aurora's kit and the fact it's just an undodgeable 1,000 damage Jarvan ulti that you can't even walk out of. Like you pretty much need a flash or a dash to be able to deal with that one. So it's just another champion where, like, you think in the past, you're like, oh, we can't really draft an immobile 80 carry in mid early on like the 1-2-3 because there's always a potential of a Jarvan coming through. And, you know, with Thresh just being such a weak champion, no one wants to deal with the, you know, potential like headshot in draft. So I think that Aurora is quite scary in the fact that if it is a strong laner, if it can just be blinded early like in Azir, but also just have this insane, almost like unoutplayable team fight presence, I think it is going to be a very scary pick and maybe something that Red Side just has to ban throughout the entire series.
Yeah, okay, well, that makes sense. I'll move on now. I guess you talked briefly on Ground Zero. Obviously, between the spring and now they've changed their roster a bit. No more Kise, Benvi moving to the coaching role. Do you think this bodes well for them overall? Because they are going to go against who, obviously, I think is the second weakest team, I would assume, in the pool for pool 2 in J Team. They've looked very shaky. Do you think they can be exploited here by Ground Zero? At least in my opinion, I certainly think the top matchup in specific should be very, very good for the side of Ground Zero. I think TN should exploit Lakai and his weak lane phase. I don't see any notable weaknesses coming out of Ground Zero, at least from what I've observed. And obviously it's pretty hard to tell, being that LCO is so separated from the world. You know, you only get to compare them to the Oceanic teams, whereas J-Team, you kind of compare them to PSG, Talon, CFO, DCG. So maybe it's hard to truly gauge their strengths. But do you feel confident? Because I think if ever there was a series that the LCO are going to beat the PCS, it's probably this one.
Yeah, I would say I'm fairly confident, and I think that it's sort of a, you know, like a failure if our, you know, first 2 seeds aren't able to take out the, you know, first competitions. I think that going further in the tournament is when it does start getting scary, as you mentioned, against like PSG, CFO, and DCG. I think specifically for Ground Zero, you know, what we saw from them in Split 1 with Kisei is they had a very star-studded roster and they were very laning focused. And if they did get towards the mid game, or if they did lose the laning phase, if they were behind early, they pretty much just lost every single game. They never ever managed to come back from, you know, being behind, being in deficits, because they didn't really have that teamwork. But I think what we thought when Kisei was gone, that Ground Zero was going to be a lot weaker because they lost that star power in the mid lane. They lost that, you know, win condition, with the fact that he would just outright win his lane the 1v1 and just carry that through the mid game. But with Fido coming in, I think he has, you know, exceeded all our expectations. You know, he's done really well in the lanes, especially against like Harry and even Raze, who swapped to the mid lane, was a traditional 80 carry player. And the fact that he wasn't finding his edges in these 80 carry matchups against Fido was very surprising for us in the playoffs happening. So I think it's very nice to see Ground Zero are this team. It's like, okay, they managed to get through laning phase and now this is where they shine. In the mid game, I think their macro is what they're really good at. I think their team play is really good. And I'd say Shunpai's pathing is you know, what this team really succeeds at, and the fact that we see them just getting CS leads consistently, XP leads, camp leads, just objective leads overall. And I think that that will be their strength. That will be Ground Zero's, you know, main focus, you know, focusing on these drafts. And the fact that Tien, a player also who last split was getting solo killed by everyone in the league without fail, but, you know, this split, is just dominating the entire league. He just looks like the best player outright, and it's really nice to see that this meta fits him as well.
Yeah.
So I'm very confident for this team, especially in their first matchup.
Honestly, you've kind of got the perfect storm here for Ground Zero, where their strength, at least from what I saw, tends to be their top jungle, kind of as you touched on, and the biggest weakness, the very glaring weakness for J-Team are those exact positions. I think Lalva has been exploited time and time again. Clearly hasn't been performing to what he used to back in the past. Like last year, Lalva was a very, very good jungler. I think this time he's been playing just Ivan, Sejuani, Maokai, doing an okay job, but ultimately just when you're going against, the Zyras, the brands, you are just bleeding CS leads. You're not really able to contest objectives, if not 3 lanes picking winning matchups. And so I think that is definitely an angle where Ground Zero should probably be able to focus their resources towards 10, towards Shenfire and find leads. As well as I think bot lane, Lemus and Kurak, just solid. They're not really out there, at least from what I saw, smashing their lane necessarily. They're not going out there finding themselves up 50 CS and a couple of kills. They're pretty happy to be even and play through the advantages the map finds, be there and support the team at these fights. And often, when they should get priority, they have it. When they shouldn't, they don't have it, and the team plays around that respectively. Matches well against into J-Team as well, because they typically only win if Chi-Chi and, it was either Enso or Yersan, whoever they decide to play with in that support position, they only kind of win when these two find a really massive lead and can carry that on through the team fight. So I think stylistically, it's a very good matchup. I think there is no real way to look at either of these teams and think, oh yeah, J-Team just have the better players, which, in the past you could kind of look at in the PCS where see like, I think these players are just man-to-man stronger players, which makes the series a lot harder. I think going in, I definitely feel confident that Ground Zero can take the series win here. Whether or not that can transition then into winning the second series up in the same side of the bracket, I'm not sure, but definitely at least round 1, I think they should be able to pick up the win pretty easily. And I'll now touch quickly on, I guess, Bliss versus Frank. I don't have nearly as much confidence in that matchup for Team Bliss. I don't think it's necessary that all the players are like outskilled or anything, but ultimately I think Frank are one of the most, I guess traditionally, not so much this split, there's been some cracks in the armor, so to speak, but I think they are just very, very talented players, and especially when it comes to team fighting. I mean, you'll often see Frank, they'll find themselves at a 1-2k gold deficit at 14 minutes, but they are very good at playing team fights. Whether they use Jimmy or Pretender in that mid lane, both are contenders for the best 2 mid laners in our region. It's like, it doesn't really matter. There'll be a stylistic difference, and that mainly comes through the lane phase more than anything. Pretty much solid. You can't really expect them to lose their lane, but I think especially Yi Jiang up on the top side, that guy is a freak. He is so insanely good at the game. And while obviously credit to BioPanther, he was probably the first person to come over the PCS and just utterly 1v9 a game from the LCO last year. I don't think that his playstyle plays well into Yi Jiang, because Yi Jiang kind of excels at picking these aggressive top lanes and just completely abusing someone that wants to try and stay relatively safe in their lane.
I touch on this because I want to point out this also counts towards Grand Zero as well. There is, one major concern for me when it comes to LCO'S coming to PCS, and is the fact that these lanes they're going to be going up against are going to be a lot more aggressive. And I think for almost the last 5-6 weeks, the jungle meta has just been full clear. All 6 camps do crab based. Repeat that. They haven't been playing against this Maokai, potential Jarvans. Like even the Sejuani has just been banned pretty much the entire split. So we haven't really seen this gank heavy meta happen. And I think there is the potential for, all this aggression to happen in the laning phase, and suddenly, oh, there's a Maokai flashing on you. There's a Sejuani on playing it, this early aggressive style that could come out of PCS and LGL is a concern for me. And, talking about that Bliss versus Frank matchup, I think there are 2 levels to Bliss. I think there's, when they have Sejuani, they look like an incredible team. Their skirmishing is really good. I think Kevin and Aldoric work really well when they have this, CC chain they can really apply in the early game. And I think that Harry on these melee mid laners is what he looks the best on, right? We talk about him being a mage player, but I think on the Yone and even on the Yasuo, when he does pull that out, I think he looks, incredible. So have to see if that's just going to be the case, or if it's just going to be, what the other teams are doing, is just ban the Sejuani, and then you come down to the next tier of Bliss, which is going to be, Bio's playing a wall in the top lane to try buy time, Harry's playing a scaler. And then the main pain point for Bliss has been Vile and Aldoric. They are this duo that just has such a high. They can really take over games, but they have been quite inconsistent. And I think that it's sort of, when Bliss fall behind, they don't really, play proactively. They just sort of turtle and it's like, all right, Does Violet have 4 items? Yes, 2 boxes ticked. Let's contest this objective now. And then they try to outplay any team fights. But so rarely do they get to that state, and so rarely have they had practice in that situation. So it's kind of hard to instill confidence that they really be able to outplay the the top of the top when it comes to PCS.
Kind of the opposite of the Ground Zero matchup, right? Where Frank, their strengths are the top lane and abusing, sort of wanting to be that wall, as you just said. And then also the bot lane. I mean, Wako and Kaiwing, the PCS has never even gotten to the point of versing Wako. They've never been able to make it because he was last year in PSG Talon. We never quite got across the line to that stage of versing those top 2 seeds. This time, Wako on Frank Esports, he is in the 4th place team, so he will be in that first stage. And Bliss, unfortunately, drawing that team, probably maybe CFO's the worst team to draw, but Frank, I would say, is a close second. I struggle to see a way to really exploit them. I mean, Kaiwing, you can exploit him in draft, and obviously there's just too many melee supports, so you can't really ban him out, but you know he's going to pick a melee support. At least that's something that 100% is guaranteed. He's locking in one of them, and that is something you can work around, right? You could get an early Braum. That's something we see people in the PCS doing, because he's not going to go randomly counter it with an enchanter or a mage. You're not going to do anything like that. He's just going to handshake it with the Nautilus Leona, whatever it may be. That is one thing you can exploit. The problem is they're just so solid. Honestly, Wako, he just spends his entire time 1v1 down the bot lane. That's kind of what the PCS is the entire time. It's not really a duo lane. Supports get level 3, recall, go top, go mid, spend the time with their jungler, while the 280 carries, which has been mostly, I guess, Ezreal, Misfortune, Zeri, traditionally has been kind of our 380 carries that have been rising to prominence. And Wako, on those 3 champs, probably 3 of the safest champs to just sit in a lane by yourself on. Misfortune, so much wave clear, of course. Ezreal and Zeri, just very safe. I struggle to see how, I guess, Bliss will be able to play the map more so than, abuse a lane, because Kaiwing is just anywhere and everywhere, I should say. And yeah, he's just always at the right place, right time. Mechanically, very, very gifted, and playing so well with Gemini in specific that it feels very difficult, especially because I at least from what I saw, Kevy was a little bit lackluster in terms of, I guess, comparison to last year more so than anything else, because last year he was kind of dominating the LCO from my memory. He was very, very talented, doing a whole lot around the map, and maybe it's a meta thing, maybe it doesn't suit towards his playstyle, but certainly this year it was a sizable difference between the amount of activity that you saw out of Kevy in the grand finals versus Schönfire, who was kind of just so far ahead every single game. Do you think there is a way that maybe in this week they get over in the PCS, a lot of scrims can come through, as well as, looking back at the VODs of Frank and looking at what Kaiwing and Wako do you think Bliss are going to be able to level up to that level of competition, match it, and outperform it?
I think we've seen a lot of different approaches from Bliss. Throughout the split, they have tried, so many different ways to, play their correct League of Legends. And I think what we saw in the finals is they tried to play that mage versus mage matchup into Ground Zero, but this is what Shun has been doing for pretty much the entire split. All 8 weeks, he was just playing mage in the jungle, so he's extremely comfy in that one. And I think that, while Kevy was doing decently, wasn't falling too far behind, just wasn't able to excel. And I think that, with him playing the Maokais, playing that low income jungler, he was also not doing too well. But what I remember from Kevy and the most success he had in this split was when he was playing those bruises in the jungler, playing the Viegos, the Zins, the Vis. I think his gank angles were very creative in particular, and I think that even his engages or his his skirmishing knowledge or experience, it just seems to be much more stronger on those champions. So I think with the return of mages in the mid lane for Harry in particular, that's going to instill some more confidence in me that they'll be able to do something in the early game in these skirmishes, because what we saw from before with it's just like the Corki and the Zyra, or the Ezreal in the mid lane or the Zeri in the mid lane with the mage jungler, they didn't really have any presence on the map, and especially if they have to play something like a Braum into the melee sports in the bot lane, all of a sudden they have no engage, they have no way to be proactive, and that's scary. That's when I think that you have to be a very high level team, very skilled team to play that kind of style, because it relies on you being a consistent or just a very excelling laner. So I think with them having engage support, fighter jungler, control mage mid, I think this is where the team will really shine. And with Aldoric being a player who can just show up to these grub fights with level 6, with a Vi or a Xin Zhao, win that skirmish, and I think that's how Bliss is going to be able to snowball, and that's what they're really going to shine at.
Okay, yeah, I have a couple more things I want to go over just very quickly, but first I'll ask, let's do a percentage of what do you think Ground Zero's chances are of, first of all, winning the round 1, and second of all, progressing through to the second stage of the playoffs, and obviously same question for Team Bliss.
I'd say looking first with Ground Zero, I think they, their first game, I'm very confident. I'd say like that's an 85% to me. But looking at their bracket, with CFO,
CFO, yeah, that's
and
rough.
Sengoku, seeing that they did so well in the LGL finals as well, that is like a very, very tough stage two. So
Yeah, Sengoku was their third place team. SoftBank have already gone to.
Okay, yeah, okay, that makes more sense. Okay, it still a bit more confidence in me, but yeah, CFO is a very scary team, and there's the kind of team that I'm afraid for OS players versus, because that is the oh, well, these guys are really aggressive. Like, I'm not used to this. I'm not used to, having to, react to everything on the map. Well, they're diving us. Like, that never happens at OS. What's going on? So I hope, with that, week prep they have before these matches start, they're able to get back into this, international gameplay style where all of a sudden on a stacked wave, you will be dope and you need to respect that. You need to play around that. So I think that they are a team who can adapt well. And I think Benvi, their coach in particular, is a very smart person and is going to, prepare well. So I think that their group is the best hope for OS in all these years. So yep. I'm quite happy for them to go forward. And I'd say against CFO, if they prepare well, I'd give them that 50-50, But on the other side for Bliss, I think it's a scary one. In particular for me, thinking about DFM in the past, like this team or this storied org is just, they're so strong and they just have so much experience. And I think their first game against Frank will be the test. If they have swaps this meta, I think if they come out with that, same style we saw them in the finals, I'm not too confident it'll work for them. But if they do swap back to, the mage and the bruiser in the jungle, I'm much more confident and they can probably match up to what Frank come. So I would say, being OS biased, I gotta go like 65% at least. They can pull it out. I believe in the boys, and I think that if they are hit or miss when it comes to Aldork. If Aldork is on, if he's feeling himself, they look like a completely different side. So we'll have to see what they really pull out. But I think for the entire group, it is a scary one. I'd have to say, I don't want it. I don't want to go below 50. I gotta stay 50-50. It's if you can or you can't. We'll see.
So Ground Zero, I think they should win their series up against J Team and probably lose to CFO. Ultimately, I'm not entirely sure of that because CFO have looked very, very shaky. But you got to assume it gets to playoffs, they can somewhat turn it on, right? Like you just have to. There's so much experience in that roster. So I think probably it's a loser's bracket angle for Ground Zero. But I think the same for Team Bliss. I think, honestly, I would have Frank winning out the first series, but I think we probably should have Bliss beating West Point in the lower bracket, which would then lead to another sort of situation that Ground Zero found themselves in last split, where you get that rematch against, be it Frank or DFM in the lower bracket, as well as on the other side, it's going to be a rematch possibly for Ground Zero up against... No, they'll be in the second phase. So they'll just be versing whoever Team Bliss were theoretically losing to in the second round of the losers bracket. So I feel like there's a very good chance that we have a LCO team come out this time of the first stage. I think the problem is that Ground Zero, obviously I've got more confidence in them to be able to do it, but they are going to have to get through either Frank or DFM. Likewise, so do Team Bliss, and that is a very scary prospect, at least in my opinion.
It's never going to be easy task, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's all going to come down to how well they prep. I think that if we think about what they really need to be able to succeed, the meta is in their favor. I think for both teams, Bliss and Ground Zero, it is flexible. It's not just like, okay, you need to play this style. We can see either carry junglers or supportive junglers and carry mid laners. And I think top lane in particular, having this ability to play, we've seen like the Orns and the Mundos, but we've also seen the Bruisers is really nice for Tien, because I think that he is an exceptional carry player and he can abuse people who will, pull out tanks. You were mentioning before how you're scared for Bio, potentially get abused if he's going to pull out these tanks. I also think Tien is a player who has been so familiar with all these matchups, and if people just blind these tanks into him, he's going to do so well. So I think the meta is good for these teams. I think that, as long as their prep is good, as long as they, communicate together and, work together as OS should, then I'm not too worried about their performances, but we'll have to see going forward, because I was pretty confident last split as well. Yeah. We all saw how that ended up.
Yeah, that lives in my head rent-free. The DCG, like 20 kill Ari at 22 minutes. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like that, honestly. I don't think I ever remember a game like that. But I got two more things. One will be more of a fun one, but first I'll start off with, and you probably out of most OS players will have the most experience at sort of dealing with this, overcoming this internationally. But I think more than individual level play, one thing that LCO has typically really, really struggled with when they come over to the PCS is not necessarily the lanes. Maybe last time there was a bit of that, but at least in 2023, the biggest issue that LCO typically faced was you'd get to team fights And you watch the LCO, right? Every single LCO game tends to get to a stage where all fights are just front to back. You kind of meet in mid lane, fight for prio, go down to river, front to back it. Whoever's better at front to back wins that team fight. Whereas in the PCS, there is very few teams that want to play front to back. There is never really a top laner who sits with his team and is just willing to sit on the front line and tank. Even when they play Cassante, oftentimes they're just looking for a teleport anywhere. They could be playing pretty much any champ whatsoever, and you're always going to have something on a flank. And it seems like whether it be vision control or just having someone mark that one person you know is on the flank, LCO seems to lack something when it comes to these objectives. And oftentimes we'd see them ahead, coming into an objective fight. They wouldn't mark someone. They wouldn't find this guy on a flank, and it would just completely break open the game for them. Do you think there's a way that this split, LCO can come in, identify this issue, fix it up? Or do you think it's just something that you're playing in LCO all year round? You're only practicing with other LCO teams. It's very hard to stylistically get practice against, the likes of, PSG scrim against LCK teams, LPL teams. They get so much practice of different styles, whereas LCO doesn't get access to. Do you think there's a way around it? Do you think there's a way that LCO can truly adapt? Because it's one thing to identify the problem, and it's another thing to completely fix it, right?
I would say it's experience. It just comes down to experience. A lot of the games in LCO are, stomps. I think that is a problem for our region because a lot of times one team gets a huge lead and then, it's either just going to be one team fight with the 5k gold lead or just a blow open of the game completely from laning phase. So we rarely see, it come down to these, team fights around the dragons and the barons where it's very close and there's all these flanks happening. I also think with the meta, being like the brand Zyra Karthus, we're not really used to seeing the flanks. We're just playing front to back consistently, just this front on engage. And I think that has, poisoned the region a little bit. But talking about how that could potentially happen to us, I'm not too worried because, Benvi is someone who always I talk to him a lot about draft, and he always mentions how, there are things you need to, work towards. You need a side laner, you need the, someone who can mark a flank. So I think he's on the ball when it comes to having these styles, and he's not just going to be like, all right, we're playing full engage into, brand. If you kill him, we win. If you don't, GG kind of thing. Yeah. So I'm not too worried about that. And I think that Bliss players, Harry, Aladoric in particular, Harry isn't a really experienced player playing over in, the LCS and NA. So he's very familiar with these concepts. And I've played with Aladoric in the past, and he is a player on the Rakan, especially who likes to look for these flanks and find these big engages. Doesn't always have to be that front to back person. On the Alistar, he is someone who likes to play for the peel, likes to play to, get Violet online because he has the hands to carry these fights, and if he does stay alive, he'll, can do it. So I think that it's just, adaptation, because also something that doesn't have a notice is there's not that same aggression. A lot of these times I see these 3-4 stack waves just crashing the towers. No one really does anything, but I know for a fact if that happens in the PCS, you are getting dove 3v2. So I'm praying we do not see just, a jungler off farming his Krugs on the other side of the map and just watching his bot lane get dove. I hope they work together to, cover each other, play on bouncing waves, just all this stuff that's going to pop up in these international events that you're just not used to in your domestic league.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you for that. I have one more question. It's more fun. As one of the most decorated mid lane players of the entirety of, Oceania's history, obviously, in the PCS, we have the side selection 1v1 showdown. We don't have it for playoffs as much as I wish we do. It's probably my favorite part of the night is watching those. But if you were to be over in the, over in Taipei and competing or what have you, if you could do one of these 1v1s, which player, it could be PCS or LCO, would you want to go against in that 1v1? And what champion do you think you'd play?
Okay, I have to pick Maple for one, because I never got to verse him internationally, but he was always someone I looked up to as being the the career slayer. I think that he always did so well against the best mid laners in the world. And my 1v1 champion that I always used to, whenever I was eagling someone, was pre-rework Aurelion Sol. I think that, weaving in the stars that used to orbit around is, that's the ultimate skill test. But if I'm playing to win, you got to lock in something like a Pantheon or a Heimer, because I just feel like those kind of champions are just extremely hard to lose the 1v1s on. Yeah,
Heimer does look really good. So far, I mean, in the PCS, the most dominant champs have always they've always been the AD carries. I think recently, finally, some of the players are working out how to deal with them a little bit more. But a lot of people just picking bruises into them and are like, oh yeah, on paper this is really good. But the problem is the AD carry just doesn't interact with you, pushes the wave, and then just takes your tower. And it's like, oh, well, this kind of sucked. But yeah, that's how it's gone. And yeah, I guess that pretty much does us for the little segment here. Thank you very much for joining us, Telly, and I hope you do enjoy, obviously, the PCS games, and I'll, like you, I'll be supporting the LCO along the way, but I do unfortunately have my doubts, as you kind of have to with the dominance coming through from many of these PCS teams. I do hope we get to see at least one time that the LCO versus PSG Talon, but who really knows?
Yeah, and I get to be completely biased because I am coming from Oceania, but you're an Oceanic resident who is casting the PCS, so you have to be objective, unfortunately.
That's right.
Whereas I myself will be on Twitter, shouting out the very highs, but also if we do see those unfortunate lows, I will be crawling back into my game.
Yeah, back onto a different game. Oh, I didn't see that one. Fair enough. Thank you very much, Tallywacker, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. And yeah, again, the PCS playoffs. Thank you so much.
Thank you.